Operation Gunnerside, the secret mission that stopped Nazi nuclear weapons. Only 11 Norwegian soldiers destroyed Hitler's Arctic nuclear weapons base with a suicide mission that almost nobody knows about. But the reason they succeeded wasn't what you'd expect. The truth is way more complicated, way more dangerous, and way more incredible than the propaganda suggests. When you hear about secret military operations in World War II, you probably think of the D-Day invasion or Operation Market Garden. Those are the famous stories. Those are the ones they make movies about. But there's another story that almost nobody knows. A story about 11 men in the Arctic. A story about a hidden Nazi base. A story about nuclear weapons that could have changed the entire war. So what really happened? How did 11 men destroy one of the most important Nazi facilities in the entire war? And what role did one pair of glasses play in saving the world? Let's talk about the truth that historians have only recently pieced together. Before we talk about Operation Gunnerside, we need to understand what the Nazis were trying to do. During World War II, both the Germans and the Allies were racing to develop nuclear weapons. They both understood that whoever got the bomb first would win the war. It was that simple. It was that important. The Nazis had some of the world's best scientists. They had uranium, they had resources, and they had a plan. The Nazis were trying to develop heavy water. Heavy water is a special type of water that's used in nuclear reactions. It's incredibly rare. It's incredibly expensive to make. And it's absolutely essential if you want to build a nuclear bomb. Without heavy water, you can't make a reactor. Without a reactor, you can't make a bomb. The problem was that heavy water was almost impossible to produce. Only a few places in the entire world could make it. One of those places was a facility in Norway called Vemork. It was a hydroelectric plant that had been specially equipped to produce heavy water. Before the war, it was run by a Norwegian company. But when the Nazis invaded Norway in 1940, they took over the plant. They took over the production. They started making heavy water for their nuclear weapons program. This was a catastrophe for the Allies. If the Nazis could produce heavy water at industrial scale, they could build a nuclear reactor. If they could build a reactor, they could make a bomb. And if they made a bomb, the Allies would lose the war. It was that serious. So the British decided something had to be done. The plant had to be destroyed, or at least the heavy water production had to be stopped. The problem was that the plant was heavily guarded. The Nazis knew how important it was. They'd stationed troops there. They'd fortified it. They'd made it into a fortress. A direct air raid might destroy the plant, but it would also kill Norwegian workers, the civilians, the people who lived in the valley below. Bombing wasn't an option, so the British came up with a different plan. They would send commandos, small teams of soldiers trained in sabotage and combat. These teams would infiltrate the plant and blow it up from the inside. It was the only way to guarantee that the facility would be destroyed without killing civilians. The team they chose was made up of Norwegian volunteers. These weren't professional soldiers. They weren't special forces operatives. They were ordinary Norwegians who had trained in Scotland for this exact mission. They were skiers and climbers. They were men who knew the terrain. They were men who understood the target. They were men who wanted to fight back against the Nazi occupation of their country. The mission was called Operation Gunnerside. It was supposed to be a suicide mission. That was the official expectation. The men were told they would probably not come back alive. They were told the odds of success were low. They were told the odds of survival were even lower. And they volunteered anyway. The operation was split into two parts. First, there would be a Pathfinder team, a small group of men who would go in advance and establish a base camp. They would prepare the ground. They would scout the target. They would get everything ready for the main attack. Then, the main team would arrive. 11 men total, 11 Norwegian soldiers who would carry out the sabotage. But everything went wrong from the start. The first team dropped by parachute. They were supposed to land safely. They didn't. Gliders crashed. Men died. The Pathfinders who survived were scattered across the mountains. They had to regroup. They had to find each other. They had to make it to the rendezvous point. And they had to do it all in the Arctic winter. The Arctic winter in Norway is brutal. Temperatures drop to -20, -30 degrees Celsius. The sun doesn't rise. It's dark all the time. The snow is deep. The wind is violent. Men die in conditions like this. Men freeze to death. Men get lost and never come back. The Pathfinders had to survive in these conditions for weeks. They had limited food. They had limited equipment. They had to survive on what they could find. Some of the Pathfinders starved. Some froze. Some disappeared into the darkness and were never found. By the time the survivors made it to the rendezvous point, they were in terrible condition. They were starving. They were exhausted. They were barely alive, but they were there. They had made it. They had prepared the ground for the main attack. Then the main team arrived. 11 men. Norwegian soldiers trained by the British. They parachuted in. They landed in the snow, and they made their way to join the Pathfinders. Now there were more than 20 men total. Norwegian soldiers in the Arctic winter, ready to attack a Nazi fortress. The team had to march to the plant. They had to cross mountains. They had to cross valleys. They had to avoid Nazi patrols. And they had to do it all in the Arctic darkness, in the extreme cold, with minimal food and equipment. The march took days. Men fell behind. Men got exhausted. Men pushed forward through conditions that should have killed them. One soldier named Knut Haugland refused to continue at one point. The team was exhausted. They had been marching for hours. They were dying. Haugland announced that he couldn't go on. He said he was finished. The other men wanted to carry him, but Haugland refused. He said he would catch up later. He said the team should go on without him. The team left him behind. They had no choice. A straggler would slow everyone down, and if they were caught, the whole mission would fail. So they left him. Haugland collapsed in the snow, apparently dying. But then something incredible happened. Haugland didn't die. He recovered. He stood up. He kept going. He walked alone through the Arctic winter, following the tracks of the other men, and somehow, incredibly, he caught up with them before they reached the plant. When the team finally reached the plant, they had to figure out how to get inside. The facility was heavily guarded. Soldiers were everywhere. Machine guns were mounted on towers. But the team had prepared. They had studied blueprints. They knew exactly where they needed to go. They knew the layout of the plant. And they knew where the heavy water production tanks were located. The team decided to approach the plant from the river. The river ran below the facility. It was frozen. Or at least partially frozen. If they could get across the river and climb up the cliff face to the plant, they might be able to get inside without being seen. It was dangerous. It was almost impossible. But it was their only chance. The team moved toward the plant. They moved slowly, quietly, hoping the guards wouldn't see them. They got to the fence. And then something happened that changed the whole mission. A dog started barking. One of the guards had let a dog loose near the perimeter. The dog had caught their scent. It was barking loudly. Loud enough to alert the guards. Loud enough to bring soldiers running. The mission was about to be discovered. Everything was about to fall apart. The team was about to be caught. And then one of the men made a decision. He decided to try to distract the dog. He stepped forward. He made noise. He tried to draw the dog's attention away from the team. He was trying to buy the others time to get away or get to shelter. But the dog ignored him. The dog kept barking. The guards were going to hear it. Everything was about to be compromised. And then, incredibly, the dog just stopped. It just stopped barking. It walked away. It went back to where it came from. Some accounts say a guard called it back. Some accounts say the dog simply lost interest. Whatever the reason, the dog stopped barking, and the team got their reprieve. The team moved forward. They reached the fence, and they realized they had a problem. The fence was electrified. If they touched it, alarms would go off. Guards would come. Everything would fail. They needed to cut through the fence. But cutting through would make noise. Cutting through would draw attention. One of the men, a sergeant named Fredrickson, made a decision. He would cut through the fence at a point where guards weren't watching. He would do it carefully, quietly, and then the team would slip through. Fredrickson took his wire cutters. He moved to the fence, and he started cutting. The fence was thick. It was strong. It was designed to keep people out. It took longer than expected. More time meant more chance of discovery. Fredrickson kept cutting. Sweat was freezing on his face in the Arctic cold. His hands were numb, but he kept cutting. Finally, he cut through. A hole in the fence, large enough for men to slip through. The team moved through the hole. They were inside the perimeter now. They were inside the Nazi fortress. They could see the plant ahead of them. They could see the heavy water tanks. They were so close. So very close to their target. Now they had to get inside the building. They had to get to the heavy water tanks. They had to plant their explosives. And they had to get out alive. The team split into groups. Some men would handle the guards if they were discovered. Other men would carry the explosives inside. One of the men with the explosives was making his way through the plant. He was moving carefully, quietly. He was navigating through the corridors of the Nazi facility, and then his glasses fell off. His eyeglasses, the ones he needed to see, they fell to the floor, and they started to slide away. He could have left them. He could have continued the mission without his glasses. Plenty of soldiers had fought without glasses. He could have managed. But for some reason, this soldier decided that he had to get his glasses back. The team was waiting. Time was critical. Every second counted. But he decided that he had to find his glasses. He bent down. He searched the floor. He felt around in the darkness. And he found his glasses. He put them back on. And he continued the mission. It seems like a trivial moment. It seems like it shouldn't matter. But this moment, this decision to stop and find his glasses, would become one of the most famous moments in military history. The soldier continued to the heavy water tanks. He planted the explosives. The other men were doing the same thing. They were planting explosives throughout the facility, at critical points, at structural weak points, everywhere that would cause maximum damage. Then, the team set the timers. 5 minutes. That was all the time they had. 5 minutes before the explosives detonated. 5 minutes to get out of the building. 5 minutes to get away from the facility. If they didn't make it, they would be caught in the blast. They would die. The men started running. They ran through the corridors of the plant. They ran toward the exits. They ran toward freedom. Behind them, the timers were counting down. 4 minutes, 3 minutes, 2 minutes. The men were outside now. They were running away from the building. 1 minute. They were putting distance between themselves and the plant, and then the explosives went off. The blast was enormous. The heavy water production facility was destroyed. The tanks exploded. The building collapsed. The infrastructure that the Nazis had built to produce nuclear materials was gone. Destroyed in an instant. But the team wasn't safe yet. The blast would have alerted every Nazi soldier for miles. Guards would be coming. Soldiers would be mobilized. The area would soon be swarming with German troops hunting for the saboteurs. The team ran into the darkness. They ran into the Arctic night. They ran toward the mountains. Behind them they could hear shouting. They could hear alarm bells. They could hear the sounds of German soldiers mobilizing to search for them. The team made it to the mountains. They got away from the facility. They were safe, at least for the moment. But now they had to survive in the Arctic winter again. They had to evade the Nazi patrols that would be hunting them. They had to make it back to friendly territory. Some of the team made it to Sweden. Sweden was neutral during the war. If they could get to Sweden, they would be safe. They wouldn't be captured by the Nazis. They might be able to escape. Other members of the team decided to stay and fight. They joined the Norwegian resistance. They continued to fight against the Nazi occupation. They became legends in Norwegian resistance circles. The mission was a complete success. The heavy water production facility was destroyed. The Nazi nuclear weapons program was set back months. Some historians argue that Operation Gunnerside delayed the Nazi atomic bomb program by years. Some argue that it delayed it so much that the Nazis could never catch up to the Allies in the nuclear race. Whether or not Operation Gunnerside directly prevented the Nazis from getting the bomb is debated by historians. We don't know exactly how close the Nazis were to building a nuclear weapon. We don't know exactly how much the destruction of the plant slowed them down. But we do know that the Nazis never got a bomb. And we do know that Operation Gunnerside was one of the most important sabotage missions of the entire war. After the war, the men who participated in Operation Gunnerside became heroes in Norway. They were celebrated, they were honored. They were recognized as the men who saved their country. But in the rest of the world, the mission remained relatively unknown. It wasn't as famous as the Normandy invasion. It wasn't as famous as other major military operations. But it was just as important, maybe more important, the soldier who stopped to pick up his glasses. We don't actually know if this incident really happened the way it's been reported. Like many stories from the war, it may have been embellished or mythologized over the decades, but it's become part of the legend of Operation Gunnerside. It's become part of the story that's been told and retold. Whether it's literally true or not, it captures something important about the mission. It captures the reality that war is not just about grand strategy and military tactics. It's about individual moments. It's about individual decisions. It's about men doing what they have to do, even when conditions are impossible. The real story of Operation Gunnerside is a story of courage. It's a story of 11 men who volunteered for a suicide mission. It's a story of men who endured the Arctic winter. It's a story of men who infiltrated a Nazi fortress. It's a story of men who succeeded against impossible odds. And it's a story that reminds us that even in the darkest war, even when facing the most brutal enemy, there are people who will stand up and fight. There are people who will volunteer to die. There are people who will do the impossible. Operation Gunnerside was one of those moments. It was one of those missions, and the men who carried it out deserve to be remembered. If you want to see more videos about the real stories from World War II that go beyond the propaganda, hit subscribe. New videos every week.